peaceful afternoon in a quiet town is shattered by the blaring sirens of a police car. A 10-year-old girl, walking home from school, suddenly finds herself handcuffed and accused of wrongdoing without any explanation. The officer's cold demeanor, the crowd's uneasy stares, and the child's silent tears paint a picture of fear and confusion. But just when it seems like injustice will prevail, an unexpected twist changes everything. A story that begins in despair turns into a fight for justice, shaking the very foundation of a small town. Before we dive into this gripping story of courage, accountability, and transformation, comment below where you're watching from today. And if this story inspires you as much as it moved us, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another powerful tale like this one. It was a serene Tuesday afternoon in the quiet town of Clearwater, where time seemed to flow gently like a lazy river. The streets were lined with charming houses, each with its little patch of green, and the air was filled with the harmonious chirping of birds. Among this peaceful backdrop, 10-year-old Lila Hart made her way home from school. Her backpack bounced lightly on her back as she hummed a cheerful tune, her mind wandering to the art project she had been working on earlier that day. The sun shone warmly, casting a golden glow over the streets, and Lila felt a comforting sense of familiarity as she passed by neighbors she had known her whole life. To her, this was just another ordinary day in Silverbrook, a town where everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. There was no reason to think anything unusual would happen until she heard it. The sharp, jarring sound of sirens tore through the tranquility, cutting her tune short. Startled, Lila froze in her tracks, her wide brown eyes darting around in search of the source of the noise. A patrol car came careening around the corner, its red and blue lights flashing vividly against the afternoon sky. Her heart skipped a beat. Surely, this had nothing to do with her. She was just walking home like she always did. The car slowed as it approached her, and the window rolled down. Inside was a man she recognized but didn't know well. Officer Grayson. Grayson had a reputation in Silverbrew and not a positive one. People whispered about his harsh demeanor, his tendency to act impulsively, and most of all, his obvious biases. To many, he was a man who judged people not by their actions, but by how well they fit his narrow view of who belonged in his town. Lila's unease deepened as she met his cold, piercing gaze. "Hey you!" Grayson barked, his voice sharp and demanding. "What are you doing wandering around here by yourself?" Lila flinched, unsure how to respond. She had walked this route alone countless times before. It wasn't unusual at all. "I'm just heading home," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly under his scrutinizing stare. But Grayson wasn't satisfied. He opened the car door, his heavy boots hitting the pavement with a thud. As he stepped toward her, his face twisted into a scowl. "I said, what are you doing here?" he repeated, his tone accusatory, as if she had no right to be on the street. "I'm just walking home," Lila stammered, clutching the straps of her backpack tightly. Her palms began to sweat as a wave of fear washed over her. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong, but the way Grayson was looking at her made her feel guilty nonetheless. "Suspicious activity," Grayson muttered under his breath. Before Lila could fully comprehend what he meant, he reached out and grabbed her arm with a grip that was far too firm for a child. "You're coming with me," he said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Lila's heart sank. "What? I didn't do anything wrong," she cried, her voice breaking. But her protests fell on deaf ears. Grayson snapped the cold metal cuffs onto her wrists, the sharp click echoing in her ears. The pain of the cuffs digging into her skin was nothing compared to the humiliation and fear she felt. She turned her head desperately, hoping for someone, anyone, to help. A few passers-by had stopped to watch, their faces a mixture of confusion and concern. Some shook their heads disapprovingly, but no one stepped forward. A couple of people pulled out their phones to record the scene, but their actions felt distant and detached, offering little comfort to Lila. "Please," Lila pleaded, her voice barely a whisper now. "I didn't do anything." But Grayson wasn't listening. He roughly guided her toward his patrol car, muttering under his breath about people who think they can get away with anything. Lila's vision blurred with tears as she was pushed into the back seat. The door slammed shut, and the world outside the window seemed to fade away. All she could hear was the sound of her own rapid breathing and the muffled noise of the sirens as Grayson turned them back on. Sitting in the cold, cramped back seat of the patrol car, Lila felt completely helpless. She was just a child, and yet she was being treated like a criminal. As the car pulled away from the curb, her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. Why was this happening? What had she done to deserve this? Through the rearview mirror, she caught a glimpse of Grayson's expression. His jaw was set, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. There was a glint of something cold in his eyes, anger, perhaps, or something darker. Lila shrank back against the seat, her small frame trembling with fear. She didn't know where they were going, but she had a sinking feeling that whatever awaited her would only make things worse. For the first time in her life, Lila felt completely and utterly powerless. The patrol car hummed steadily as it sped through the quiet streets of Silverbrook. Lila sat motionless in the back seat, her small hands struggling against the cold steel of the handcuffs that bit into her wrists. The harsh material chafed her skin, leaving faint red marks. Her mind swirled with confusion and fear, her thoughts moving too fast to focus on any one thing. All she wanted was to go home, but instead, here she was, trapped in a police car with no explanation as to why she'd been arrested. Officer Grayson drove in silence for a while, his jaw clenched and his eyes fixed on the road. He muttered under his breath occasionally, words too low for Lila to hear, but the tone of his voice was unmistakably sharp. His knuckles gripped the steering wheel so tightly they turned white, and Lila couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just angry, he was furious. She turned her gaze to the window, watching the familiar streets blur past. The houses she knew so well looked distorted now, like they belonged to a world she could no longer reach. Lila's chest tightened as a wave of despair washed over her. She felt tears stinging her eyes again but blinked them away, refusing to let them fall. Crying wouldn't help. Nothing would help. "Why are you doing this?" she finally mustered the courage to ask, her voice trembling but steady enough to be heard. Grayson glanced at her briefly through the rearview mirror, his icy blue eyes narrowing. "You think you can walk around this town like you own it?" he snapped. "Not on my watch." Lila didn't understand what he meant. She had lived in Silverbrook her whole life. How could walking home from school be a crime? "I wasn't doing anything wrong," she said softly, her voice almost drowned out by the hum of the engine. Grayson let out a humorless laugh. "They always say that," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Lila didn't respond. She was too afraid to argue further, worried that anything she said might make things worse. The car eventually came to a halt in front of the Silverbrook police station, a looming brick building with barred windows that seemed to stare down at her like accusing eyes. Grayson shifted the car into park, the gears grinding loudly in the stillness. "Out," he barked as he opened the back door. Lila hesitated, her legs feeling like jelly as she tried to move. Grayson reached in and grabbed her arm, pulling her out of the car with little care for her discomfort. She stumbled slightly, but managed to regain her footing. The air was cooler now, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. Lila shivered, though not from the temperature. Grayson kept a firm grip on her arm as he led her toward the entrance of the station. The heavy metal door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit interior that smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee. Inside, the atmosphere was no less intimidating. The walls were lined with dark wood paneling, and the tiled floor echoed their footsteps as they walked. Officers moved about with purposeful strides, their expressions a mixture of boredom and focus. But no one stopped to question why Grayson was dragging a 10-year-old girl in handcuffs through the building. Lila's heart raced as they passed a series of closed doors. She could hear muffled voices from behind them. Arguments, laughter, the occasional clatter of something heavy being moved. It all felt surreal, like a dream she couldn't wake up from. Grayson guided her to a small holding room at the back of the station. The space was stark and unwelcoming, with plain white walls and a single metal bench bolted to the floor. "Sit," he ordered, gesturing to the bench. Lila obeyed, lowering herself carefully onto the cold, hard surface. She winced as the handcuffs dug further into her wrists, but she didn't dare complain. Grayson leaned against the wall, arms crossed over his chest as he stared at her. His expression was unreadable, but his posture exuded authority. For a few minutes, they sat in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on Lila like a heavy blanket. She wanted to say something, to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. The door opened suddenly, breaking the tense stillness. A woman entered the room, her dark hair pulled back into a neat bun and a file folder tucked under her arm. She wore a standard police uniform, but there was something different about her demeanor. Something calmer, less intimidating. Her name tag read Officer Ramirez. "Grayson," she said, her voice even but firm. "I'll take it from here." Grayson frowned, clearly displeased. "She's my suspect," he replied, his tone defensive. "She's a child," Ramirez shot back, her gaze steady, "and I'll handle it." Grayson hesitated for a moment, then let out an annoyed huff and left the room, the door clicking shut behind him. Ramirez turned her attention to Lila, her expression softening as she approached the bench. She crouched down slightly so that she was at eye level with the girl. "Hi there," she said gently. "I'm Officer Ramirez." "What's your name?" "Lila," the girl replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lila," Ramirez repeated with a small nod. "Okay, Lila, I'm here to help. I need you to tell me what happened. Can you do that?" Lila hesitated, her eyes darting to the door as if expecting Grayson to burst back in at any moment. "It's okay," Ramirez reassured her. "You're safe now. Just take your time." Encouraged by Ramirez's kindness, Lila began to speak. She explained how she had been walking home from school, how Grayson had stopped her out of nowhere and accused her of doing something wrong. As she spoke, Ramirez listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes in the file she carried. Her calm demeanor put Lila at ease, and for the first time since the ordeal began, the girl felt a glimmer of hope. Ramirez closed the file and looked at Lila with a serious expression. "Thank you for telling me, Lila," she said. "I'm going to look into this, and I promise we'll get to the bottom of it. You're not alone in this." Lila nodded, her throat tight with emotion. For the first time, it felt like someone was actually listening. Lila sat quietly on the cold metal bench, her small hands resting on her lap, now that Officer Ramirez had removed the handcuffs. She gently rubbed her sore wrists, and the faint red marks were a reminder of the ordeal she was still trying to process. Her gaze remained fixed on the floor, but her thoughts were a whirlwind of emotions, fear, confusion, and now, a faint spark of hope that perhaps someone finally believed her. Bookmark. The room was silent, except for the faint murmur of voices from outside. Officer Ramirez stood by the door, her arms crossed, and her expression thoughtful as she reviewed the notes she had taken. Occasionally, her eyes flicked toward Lila, a look of quiet determination on her face. "Lila," Ramirez said, breaking the silence, "I'm going to need you to stay here for a little while longer. I need to speak with someone about this." Lila nodded, her voice too shaky to respond. Ramirez gave her a reassuring smile before stepping out of the room, the door clicking shut behind her. The silence that followed was oppressive. Lila shifted uncomfortably on the bench, her mind replaying the events of the past hour. She couldn't understand why Grayson had targeted her, or why he had treated her with such hostility. She was just a kid. What could she have possibly done to deserve this? Outside the room, the tension in the police station was palpable. Ramirez made her way down the corridor, her boots clicking softly against the tiled floor. She stopped in front of another office and knocked firmly before stepping inside. "Captain Hayes," she said, addressing the older man seated behind a cluttered desk. His graying hair and lined face spoke of years of experience, and his sharp blue eyes lifted from the paperwork he had been reviewing. "What is it, Ramirez?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. "It's about Grayson," Ramirez began, her tone measured but firm. "He brought in a 10-year-old girl, handcuffed her, on vague accusations of suspicious activity. From what I've gathered, she was just walking home from school." Hayes frowned, his expression darkening. "This isn't the first complaint I've had about Grayson," he muttered, almost to himself. "But handcuffing a child? That's crossing a line." Ramirez nodded. "I've been looking into his record, and there's a pattern of questionable behavior. We need to address this before it gets any worse." The captain sighed heavily, pinching the bridge of his nose. "All right, I'll handle Grayson. In the meantime, I want you to stay with the girl. Make sure she's okay and get her statement documented thoroughly. If Grayson's been abusing his authority, we're gonna need all the evidence we can get. Understood, Ramirez replied, turning on her heel and heading back toward the holding room. Meanwhile, in the small room, Lila's anxiety was beginning to ease, replaced by curiosity about what was happening outside. She glanced toward the door every so often, her ears straining to catch any sound of approaching footsteps. When the door finally opened again, she jumped slightly, but her tension eased when she saw Ramirez's familiar face. "Hi, Lila," Ramirez said gently as she stepped inside and closed the door behind her. She carried a small bottle of water, which she handed to the girl. "Here, drink this. You've had a rough day." "Thank you," Lila murmured, twisting off the cap and taking a small sip. Ramirez sat down on a chair opposite the bench, her posture relaxed but professional. "I've spoken to my captain," she said. "We're going to look into what happened, but I need you to help me understand everything clearly." "Can you do that for me?" Lila nodded hesitantly. "Okay." "Good," Ramirez said with a reassuring smile. "Let's start from the beginning. What were you doing right before Officer Grayson stopped you?" Lila took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "I was walking home from school," she began. "I always take the same route. I wasn't doing anything different or strange. Then I heard the sirens and he pulled up beside me." "What did he say to you?" Ramirez prompted, her pen poised over her notepad. "He asked me what I was doing, and I told him I was just going home," Lila replied. "But he didn't believe me. He kept saying I looked suspicious, but I didn't do anything." Her voice wavered, and Ramirez reached out to place a comforting hand on her shoulder. "It's okay, Lila," she said softly. "Take your time." Lila nodded, blinking back tears. Then he grabbed my arm and put me in handcuffs. I tried to tell him I didn't do anything, but he wouldn't listen. He just shoved me into his car and brought me here. Ramirez frowned, her pen moving swiftly across the notepad. "And you've never seen him act like this toward anyone else before?" Lila hesitated. "Not like this, but I've heard people talk about him. They say he's mean to people who don't look like him." The officer's expression hardened, though her tone remained calm. "Thank you for telling me, Lila. I know this isn't easy, but you're helping us a lot." The girl offered a small, hesitant smile, grateful for Ramirez's kindness. As they finished their conversation, the door opened again, and Captain Hayes stepped inside. His gaze immediately softened when he saw Lila. "Hi, Lila," he said, his voice gentle. "I'm Captain Hayes. I just wanted to come by and see how you're doing." Lila shrugged slightly. "I'm okay, I guess." "I'm glad to hear that," Hayes replied. "I also want you to know that we're taking what happened to you very seriously. Officer Ramirez is going to make sure you're safe and will be looking into everything that happened today. Do you understand?" "Yes," Lila said softly. Hayes exchanged a glance with Ramirez, a silent understanding passing between them. Then he looked back at Lila. "We're going to make this right," he promised. For the first time that day, Lila felt a flicker of relief. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but at least she wasn't alone anymore. The door to the holding room closed softly as Captain Hayes and Officer Ramirez left, leaving Lila alone again. This time, however, the oppressive silence felt a little less heavy. The captain's words, "We're going to make this right," echoed in her mind, giving her a sliver of hope to cling to. Still, the fear lingered. She fidgeted on the bench, her fingers twisting nervously as she tried to make sense of everything that had happened. She thought of her mother, probably waiting at home and wondering why she hadn't returned from school. Would her mom be angry, worried, or worse, disappointed? Before Lila could spiral too far into her thoughts, the door opened abruptly. This time, it wasn't Ramirez or the captain. It was Officer Grayson. Her stomach dropped. Grayson's face was tight with anger, his expression a storm cloud of barely restrained fury. He stood in the doorway for a moment, his eyes fixed on her with a cold, piercing glare. "You think you're special, don't you?" he sneered, stepping into the room and letting the door shut behind him. Lila shrank back against the wall, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what to say. What could she possibly say to someone who seemed to despise her for reasons she couldn't understand? Grayson crossed his arms over his chest, his stance imposing. "I've dealt with kids like you before," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "Always playing the victim, always thinking you're above the rules." I didn't do anything," Lila stammered, her voice barely audible. Of course you didn't, he shot back sarcastically. That's what they all say. Lila's hands clenched into fists in her lap. She wanted to defend herself, to scream at him that she wasn't like whoever he thought she was. But her voice was caught in her throat, strangled by fear. Grayson's tirade was interrupted by the sound of the door opening again. Officer Ramirez stepped inside, her expression sharp as her eyes flicked between Grayson and Lila. "What's going on here?" Ramirez demanded, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Just having a conversation," Grayson replied smoothly, though his posture stiffened under Ramirez's scrutiny. "Out," Ramirez said firmly, pointing toward the door. Grayson hesitated, his jaw tightening as if he were about to argue, but Ramirez's steady gaze didn't waver. Finally, with a muttered curse, he stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Ramirez turned to Lila, her expression softening as she crouched down to meet the girl's eyes. "Are you okay?" Lila nodded shakily, though her body was still trembling. He said I did something wrong," she murmured. "But I didn't." "I know you didn't," Ramirez assured her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "And I won't let him scare you again, I promise." The sincerity in Ramirez's voice brought a fresh wave of tears to Lila's eyes, but this time they were tears of relief. She wiped them away quickly, embarrassed, and gave the officer a small nod. Outside the holding room, Captain Hayes was waiting for Ramirez. His face darkened when she explained what had just happened. "That's it," Hayes said, his tone grim. "Grayson's out of control. We need to act now." Ramirez nodded in agreement. "Do we have enough to take him off duty?" "With the complaints piling up and his behavior today?" Hayes replied, "Absolutely. I'll make the call." Back in the holding room, Lila sat quietly, her heart still racing from the encounter with Grayson. But she also felt a strange sense of strength bubbling beneath her fear. For the first time, someone was standing up for her, someone who believed in her innocence. The minutes ticked by slowly until the door opened again. This time, it wasn't Ramirez or Grayson. It was someone Lila hadn't seen before, a woman with sharp eyes and a commanding presence. She introduced herself as Lieutenant Harper, one of the senior officers at the station. Her uniform was pristine, and the air around her seemed to buzz with authority. "Hello, Lila," Harper said, her tone calm but firm. "I've been briefed on your situation, and I want you to know that we take this very seriously." Lila nodded, unsure of what to say. Harper's presence was intimidating, but there was a reassurance in her voice that put Lila slightly at ease. "I've spoken with Officer Ramirez and Captain Hayes," Harper continued. "We've decided to take immediate action against Officer Grayson. What he did to you was unacceptable, and we're not going to let it slide." Lila blinked, the words sinking in slowly. Grayson was going to face the consequences of what he had done. Harper seemed to sense her confusion. "You've been very brave today," she said. "And because of your courage, we're able to address a serious problem in our department." "This isn't your fault, Lila. None of it is." Tears welled in Lila's eyes again, but this time, she didn't try to hide them. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "We're also going to make sure you get home safely," Harper added. "Officer Ramirez will stay with you until your mom arrives." "Thank you," Lila managed to whisper, her voice trembling. Harper gave her a small, reassuring smile before leaving the room to oversee the next steps. As the door closed behind her, Lila felt a weight begin to lift from her shoulders. The fear was still there, but it was now tempered by the knowledge that she wasn't alone. People were fighting for her, and for the first time, she felt like justice might actually be possible. Ramirez returned a few minutes later, carrying a warm blanket. She draped it over Lila's shoulders and sat down beside her on the bench. "You're doing great, kiddo," Ramirez said gently. "I know this has been scary, but you've been so strong." Lila leaned into the officer's comforting presence, her small body finally starting to relax. She didn't know what would happen next, but she trusted Ramirez to keep her safe. And for the first time since this nightmare began, she believed that everything might just be okay. Lila remained seated on the bench, the blanket draped over her shoulders, providing a small measure of comfort. The tension in her chest was still present, but Ramirez's calm presence beside her helped steady her nerves. The officer's soft-spoken reassurances felt genuine, something Lila hadn't expected to find in a police station after what she had been through. Outside the holding room, the station buzzed with quiet but intense activity. Officer Ramirez had returned briefly to speak with Lieutenant Harper and Captain Hayes about the next steps. The decision was clear. Officer Grayson had crossed a line, and immediate action was necessary. Lieutenant Harper's stern voice carried through the hall as she addressed a small group of officers. "We've reviewed the complaints and corroborated his actions today. Officer Grayson has exhibited behavior that not only undermines the integrity of this department, but puts the community at risk. Effective immediately, he's being relieved of duty pending further investigation." A ripple of unease passed through the group. Some officers exchanged glances, while others nodded in agreement. Grayson's reputation had been a point of contention for a while, but few had been willing to challenge him directly. Now, the weight of evidence had become too much to ignore. Meanwhile, Grayson was in a different part of the station, pacing back and forth in a small break room. His frustration was palpable, his heavy footsteps echoing in the confined space. He muttered to himself, the words fragmented and laced with anger. When the door opened and Captain Hayes entered, Grayson stopped abruptly, his expression shifting to one of guarded defensiveness. "Grayson," Hayes began, his voice calm but authoritative. "We need to talk." "About what?" Grayson snapped, his arms crossing over his chest. "That kid?" She was acting suspiciously. "I was doing my job." "Your job," Hayes repeated, his tone hardening. "Your job does not include handcuffing a 10-year-old for walking home from school. It does not include targeting individuals based on personal bias." Grayson opened his mouth to argue, but Hayes raised a hand to silence him. "We've received multiple complaints about your conduct," Hayes continued. "Today's incident was the last straw. You're being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending an internal investigation." Grayson's face turned pale, his bravado faltering. "You can't be serious," he said, his voice low and incredulous. "I am," Hayes replied firmly. "Turn in your badge and firearm." Now, for a moment, Grayson seemed frozen, as if he couldn't comprehend what was happening. Then, reluctantly, he reached for his belt, unfastening his badge and sidearm and handing them over. His jaw was tight, his eyes flashing with a mixture of anger and humiliation. "This is a mistake," he muttered as Hayes took the items. "You'll regret this." "No," Hayes said coldly. "The only mistake here was thinking your behavior would go unchecked forever." Grayson's hands clenched into fists, but he didn't respond. Hayes gave him one last hard look before turning and leaving the room. Back in the holding area, Ramirez returned to Lila's side, her face calm but resolute. "Lila," she said gently, "I wanted to let you know that Officer Grayson has been removed from duty. He won't be able to hurt anyone else." Lila's eyes widened in surprise. "Really?" she asked, her voice a mixture of disbelief and relief. "Really," Ramirez confirmed with a small smile. "You did the right thing by speaking up. Because of you, we're able to take action." Lila nodded slowly, her emotions swirling. She felt a strange mixture of relief and pride, but also a lingering sadness. Despite everything, it was hard to process that someone with so much authority could have used it so carelessly. "Will he go to jail?" Lila asked hesitantly. "That depends on the investigation," Ramirez replied honestly. "But what matters right now is that you're safe, and we're taking steps to make sure this doesn't happen again." The door to the holding room opened again, and this time it was Lieutenant Harper. She stepped inside with a calm but serious expression, her sharp eyes assessing Lila with quiet empathy. "Lila," Harper said, her voice steady, "your mom is on her way. She's been informed about everything that's happened, and she'll be here soon to take you home." Lila's heart lifted at the mention of her mom. She had been so focused on the ordeal that she hadn't even realized how much she longed for the comfort of her mother's embrace. "Thank you," Lila said softly, looking at both Harper and Ramirez. "You're welcome," Harper replied. She crouched slightly so that she was at eye level with Lila. "You've been incredibly brave today. What happened to you was wrong, and I promise you, we're going to make things right." A knock on the door interrupted them, and Harper stood to open it. A female officer stepped inside and whispered something to Harper, who nodded before turning back to Lila. "Your mom's here," Harper said with a smile. Lila stood quickly, the blanket slipping off her shoulders as she hurried toward the door. Harper opened it, revealing a woman standing just outside, her face etched with worry and relief. "Mom!" Lila cried, rushing forward. Her mother dropped to her knees and wrapped Lila in a tight embrace, her arms trembling as she held her daughter close. "Oh, baby," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "Are you okay? I was so scared." "I'm okay now," Lila replied, her voice muffled against her mom's shoulder. "They helped me." Her mom pulled back slightly, her hands cupping Lila's face as she examined her closely. "What happened? Why did this happen to you?" "It's a long story," Lila said quietly. "I'll tell you everything when we get home." Harper and Ramirez watched the reunion with quiet smiles, the tension in the room easing as mother and daughter clung to each other. "Thank you," Lila's mom said, looking up at the two officers. "Thank you for taking care of her." "It's our job," Ramirez replied warmly. "And if you have any questions or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out. We're here to help." As Lila and her mom prepared to leave, Harper added one final note. "Lila, you've made a difference today. Don't ever forget that." Lila nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and gratitude. As they walked out of the station, she felt the warmth of her mother's hand in hers and the weight of the day's events slowly lifting from her shoulders. For the first time, she began to believe that justice was not just a distant idea. It was something real, something possible, and something worth fighting for. The ride home was quiet, the hum of the car engine filling the silence as Lila stared out the window. The familiar streets of Silverbrook passed by, their calm and peaceful demeanor feeling almost surreal after everything that had happened. Lila's mom glanced over at her occasionally, her worry etched into her face. She didn't press her daughter to talk, knowing that Lila needed time to process everything. But her presence was steady, her hand reaching out every so often to rest reassuringly on Lila's knee. When they pulled into the driveway of their modest home, Lila felt a strange mixture of relief and unease. She was home, yes, but she couldn't shake the weight of what had happened. It wasn't something she could leave behind at the police station. It had followed her here, lingering in her chest like a heavy stone. Inside, the house was exactly as she had left it that morning. The faint smell of lavender air freshener wafted through the air, and the sunlight streaming through the windows gave the space a warm glow. But to Lila, it felt different now. Her mom set her purse down on the kitchen counter and turned to Lila, her eyes soft but serious. "Let's sit down," she said gently, pulling out a chair at the dining table. Lila hesitated before sitting, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her mom sat across from her, leaning forward slightly as if to close the space between them. "Can you tell me what happened?" her mom asked, her voice calm but laced with concern. "I want to understand." Lila took a deep breath, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. She started from the beginning, recounting how she had been walking home from school when Officer Grayson stopped her. She described the way he had spoken to her, how he accused her of being suspicious without any reason, and how he had handcuffed her despite her protests. Her mom's face grew darker with each word, her hands clenching into fists on the table. "He had no right to do that," she said firmly when Lila finished. "No right at all." "I didn't do anything wrong," Lila said softly, her voice trembling. "Why did he treat me like that?" Her mom reached out, taking Lila's hands in hers. "Because some people like him think they can get away with it," she said. "But you didn't let him. You were brave, Lila. You told the truth, and now he's going to face the consequences." Lila nodded, her mom's words sinking in slowly. It was hard to think of herself as brave when she had felt so scared, but maybe bravery wasn't about not being afraid. Maybe it was about speaking up even when you were terrified. Her mom squeezed her hands gently. "We're going to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else," she said. "Your story matters, Lila. It's going to make a difference." Later that evening, as the house settled into its usual rhythm, Lila sat on her bed, her phone resting in her hands. She had been scrolling through messages from friends who had heard about what happened, their words of support and concern filling her screen. But Lila felt a pull to do more. It wasn't enough just to share her story with her friends. She wanted people to understand, to see what had happened and why it was wrong. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she crafted a message for her social media page. She typed carefully, choosing her words with intention. "Yesterday, I was stopped by a police officer while walking home from school. He accused me of being suspicious and arrested me, even though I didn't do anything wrong. I was scared and confused, but I spoke up, and now he's being held accountable. This isn't just about me, it's about everyone who's ever been treated unfairly. We need to stand together and make sure this doesn't keep happening. Our voices matter, and we can make a difference. Lila stared at the screen for a moment before hitting post. A rush of nerves and determination coursed through her as the message went live. It didn't take long for people to notice. Within minutes, comments and likes began pouring in. Friends and classmates expressed their support, while others, people Lila didn't even know, shared her post, spreading her story further than she had imagined. The responses were overwhelming, but they filled Lila with a sense of purpose. For the first time since the ordeal began, she felt like she was in control of her narrative. The next morning, as the sun rose over Silverbrook, Lila woke to find her phone buzzing incessantly. She rubbed her eyes and picked it up, her heart skipping a beat as she saw dozens of notifications. Her post had gone viral. Messages of support poured in from strangers, many of whom shared their own stories of injustice. Others thanked her for speaking out, saying her bravery had inspired them. But among the positive comments were a few that stung. Some people questioned her story, accusing her of exaggerating or seeking attention. Lila's chest tightened as she read their words, doubt creeping in despite the overwhelming support she had received. Her mom noticed her quiet mood during breakfast and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" she asked. "Some people don't believe me," Lila admitted, her voice small. "They think I'm making it up." Her mom knelt beside her, meeting her eyes. "Listen to me, Lila. You know the truth. You were there, and you stood up for yourself. The people who don't believe you, they're just scared of change. Don't let them take away your courage." Lila nodded slowly, her mom's words giving her the strength to push past the negativity. That afternoon, as Lila sat on the porch, her phone rang. The screen displayed an unfamiliar number, and she hesitated before answering. "Hello?" she said cautiously. "Hi, is this Lila Hart?" a warm, professional voice asked. "This is Jessica from the Silverbrook Gazette. We've seen your story, and we'd love to speak with you about it for an upcoming piece on police accountability. Would you be willing to share your experience?" Lila's breath caught in her throat. A reporter wanted to talk to her. After a brief pause, she found her voice. "Yes," she said firmly. "I'd like that." As the conversation unfolded, Lila realized that her story was no longer just hers. It had become a part of something bigger, a movement for justice and change. By the time Lila ended her call with Jessica from the Silverbrook Gazette, her hands were trembling slightly. Not from fear, but from a strange mixture of excitement and apprehension. The idea of her story being shared with an even larger audience was daunting, yet it also filled her with a renewed sense of purpose. Her mom had been listening nearby, and when Lila hung up, she walked over and wrapped her daughter in a gentle hug. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart," her mom said, her voice full of warmth. "This is a big step." "It's a little scary," Lila admitted, resting her head on her mom's shoulder. "I know," her mom replied, smoothing Lila's hair. "But you're doing something important. You're helping people see what's wrong so they can make it right." The next day, Jessica from the Gazette arrived at their house with a notepad and recorder in hand. She was a kind-looking woman in her 30s, with curly brown hair and a friendly smile that immediately put Lila at ease. "Hi, Lila," Jessica said warmly as she sat down at the kitchen table. "Thank you for agreeing to talk with me. I know this can't be easy, but your story is powerful, and I believe it's one people need to hear." Lila nodded, taking a deep breath to steady herself. "I'm ready," she said. For the next hour, she recounted the events of that fateful day, how she had been stopped, handcuffed, and brought to the station without any explanation. She described her fear and confusion, the kindness of Officer Ramirez, and the relief she felt when she learned that Grayson was being held accountable. Jessica listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes or asking gentle follow-up questions. Her demeanor was compassionate yet professional, and Lila felt a sense of safety in her presence. When the interview ended, Jessica turned off her recorder and leaned forward slightly. "Lila, I want you to know that your bravery in speaking out is remarkable," she said. "This article isn't just about what happened to you. It's about shining a light on a problem that affects so many people. You're helping to start a conversation that's long overdue." Lila smiled shyly, her cheeks flushing at the praise. "I just don't want this to happen to anyone else," she said simply. "And that's exactly why your voice matters," Jessica replied. A few days later, the article was published. It details Ella's story, but also includes accounts from others in Silverbrook who had faced similar mistreatment. The Gazette highlighted the need for accountability and systemic change within the police department, sparking a wave of discussion throughout the town. Lila's name quickly became known, not just among her friends and classmates, but across the community. People approached her at school to offer their support, and teachers praised her courage during class. But the attention wasn't always positive. While many rallied around her, there were those who criticized her for speaking out, accusing her of exaggerating or trying to draw unnecessary attention to herself. "Why didn't you just let it go?" one classmate muttered under their breath as Lila walked past them in the hallway. "It's not like anything really bad happened." The words stung, but Lila held her head high, determined not to let the negativity silence her. During a meeting with the school principal, Miss Turner, Lila was invited to speak at an upcoming assembly about her experience and the importance of standing up for what's right. "It's a chance to help your peers understand what happened and why it matters," Miss Turner explained. "You've already inspired so many people, Lila. This could be another step toward making a difference." Lila hesitated. The thought of standing in front of her entire school and sharing something so personal was intimidating, but she also knew it was an opportunity to turn her experience into something meaningful. "I'll do it," she said after a moment, her voice steady. When the day of the assembly arrived, the auditorium was packed with students and teachers. Lila stood backstage, her palms clammy and her heart pounding in her chest. Her mom and Miss Turner stood beside her, offering words of encouragement. "You're going to be amazing," her mom said, squeezing her hand. As her name was announced, Lila stepped onto the stage, her legs feeling like jelly as she approached the microphone. She looked out at the sea of faces before her, each pair of eyes fixed on her expectantly. For a moment, she felt the familiar pang of fear creeping in, but then she thought of Officer Ramirez's words. "You've made a difference today." Taking a deep breath, Lila began to speak. "Hi everyone," she said, her voice shaking slightly but growing stronger with each word. "My name is Lila Hart, and I want to tell you about something that happened to me. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't right, but it showed me how important it is to speak up when something is wrong." She recounted her story, her voice steady and clear as she described the fear, the injustice, and the strength she found in herself to fight back. "I'm not just telling you this because it happened to me," she continued. "I'm telling you because it could happen to anyone. And if it does, I want you to know that your voice matters. You don't have to stay silent. You can make a difference, just like I'm trying to." The room was silent when she finished, her words hanging in the air like a spark waiting to ignite. Then slowly, the applause began, building into a thunderous ovation that left Lila blinking back tears. After the assembly, students and teachers approached her to thank her for sharing her story. Some even opened up about their own experiences with unfair treatment, their voices filled with emotion as they spoke. For the first time, Lila felt the full weight of what her bravery had accomplished. Her story wasn't just hers anymore, it was a catalyst for change, and Rima Inder knew that even the smallest voices could make a big impact. That evening, as she sat with her mom on the porch, Lila reflected on everything that had happened since that day on the sidewalk. "I didn't think I could do any of this," she admitted softly. Her mom smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "You're stronger than you know, Lila. And this is just the beginning." As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Lila felt a quiet but powerful sense of peace. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She had found her voice, and she wasn't going to stop using it. In the days following Lila's assembly speech, the ripples of her story spread further than she ever could have imagined. At first, it was mostly within her school, with students discussing her courage during lunch breaks and teachers using her story as a teachable moment about fairness and standing up against injustice. But soon, the conversations expanded beyond the school walls, spilling into the larger Silverbrook community. The article in the Silverbrook Gazette gained traction, catching the attention of local organizations and activists who had long been advocating for accountability in the police department. They reached out to Lila's mom, asking if Lila would be willing to attend community meetings and share her story as part of a broader conversation about systemic change. Lila was hesitant at first. The thought of stepping into a room full of adults, people she didn't know, and speaking about her experience felt overwhelming. But every time she considered saying no, she thought about the other kids in Silverbrook who might have gone through something similar or might in the future. She didn't want anyone else to feel the fear and helplessness she had felt that day. With her mom's encouragement, Lila agreed to attend her first meeting. The community center was bustling with energy when they arrived. The large room filled with people of all ages and backgrounds. Some were holding signs with messages like "Justice for All" and "Hold them accountable," while others were deep in conversation about potential solutions. Lila's mom stayed close to her, offering quiet words of reassurance as they found their seats near the front of the room. The meeting began with a few speakers sharing their perspectives on the need for reform in the local police department. They talked about policies that needed to change, the importance of building trust between law enforcement and the community, and the role individuals could play in driving that change. When it was Lila's turn to speak, she stood slowly, her small frame dwarfed by the podium. The room fell silent as she adjusted the microphone, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. "Hi," she began, her voice a little shaky but growing steadier as she continued. "My name is Lila Hart, and I want to share my story with you." She recounted her experience once again, but this time she framed it within the context of the larger issue. She spoke about how being stopped and handcuffed by Officer Grayson had made her feel powerless and invisible, but also about how finding the strength to speak up had changed everything. "I'm not just here because of what happened to me," Lila said, her voice strong. "I'm here because I want to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. I believe we can do better. We have to do better for everyone." When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Some people stood, clapping enthusiastically, as others wiped away tears. Lila stepped back from the podium, her heart pounding as a mixture of relief and pride washed over her. After the meeting, several attendees approached her to thank her for her bravery. One woman, who introduced herself as Carla, shared how her son had experienced something similar but had been too afraid to speak out. "You're giving people like him hope," Carla said, her eyes glistening with emotion. "Thank you, Lila." That night, as Lila and her mom walked back to their car, the air was cool and crisp, and the stars shone brightly above them. Lila felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in weeks. "You were amazing," her mom said, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "You're really making a difference." Lila smiled, though she still found it hard to believe. "It doesn't feel like I'm doing much," she admitted. "Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest steps," her mom replied. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Lila attended more community meetings, Kate participated in discussions about police reform, and even joined a youth council focused on bridging the gap between young people and law enforcement. Through it all, she continued to share her story, not just as a tale of injustice, but as a call to action. Her words resonated with people from all walks of life, inspiring them to examine their own experiences and consider how they could contribute to creating a fairer system. Meanwhile, the investigation into Officer Grayson gained momentum. More people came forward with complaints about his behavior, painting a damning picture of a pattern of misconduct that had gone unchecked for far too long. Eventually, the police department announced that Grayson had been formally dismissed from his position. The news was met with a mixture of relief and satisfaction from the community, though many acknowledged that his removal was only the first step in addressing the larger issues within the department. Lila learned about Grayson's dismissal one afternoon while she was at school. Her mom texted her the news, and for a moment she simply stared at her phone, her emotions swirling. When she got home that evening, she sat with her mom on the porch, the cool breeze rustling the leaves of the trees around them. "It's over," Lila said quietly. "Part of it is," her mom replied, "but the work isn't done yet. There's still so much to fix." Lila nodded, her resolve hardening. "I want to keep helping," she said. "I want to keep speaking out." Her mom smiled, pride shining in her eyes. "I knew you would." That weekend, Lila attended a rally at the community park. The event was organized by several local groups and featured speakers from different backgrounds, all united by a shared goal of justice and accountability. Lila was one of the youngest speakers there, but her words carried weight. She stood on the makeshift stage, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. "What happened to me could have happened to anyone," she said, "but it shouldn't have happened at all. We all deserve to feel safe, no matter who we are or where we come from. And together, we can make that happen." The crowd erupted in cheers, their enthusiasm filling the air with an energy that was almost tangible. As Lila stepped down from the stage, she felt a sense of hope, unlike anything she had experienced before. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about something much bigger. And she was ready to keep fighting. Months passed, and though the intensity of the initial spotlight on Lila's story began to fade, its impact continued to grow. The investigation into Officer Grayson revealed a troubling history of misconduct, including numerous complaints that had previously been ignored or dismissed. His dismissal from the force was a relief to many, but it also served as a stark reminder of how much work remained to be done to ensure accountability in Silverbrook's police department. For Lila, life slowly returned to a new version of normal. She went back to her daily routines, school, hanging out with friends, and spending time with her mom. But she was no longer the same girl she had been before that fateful day. Her classmates now saw her as someone who had stood up to injustice and won, and they treated her with a newfound respect. Teachers occasionally referenced her story during lessons on courage and civil rights, using her as an example of how one voice could make a difference. Yet the journey hadn't been without its challenges. Not everyone was supportive of the changes her story had sparked. Some members of the community grumbled about unnecessary attention being brought to the town's police force, and anonymous comments on social media criticized Lila for stirring up trouble. At first, the negativity weighed heavily on her. It was hard not to feel hurt by the harsh words of strangers who didn't even know her. But every time she felt discouraged, Lila reminded herself of the people she had helped, the kids like Carla's son, who now had hope because of her bravery. One Saturday afternoon, Lila was helping her mom fold laundry when her phone buzzed with a new notification. She picked it up and saw an email from a local youth organization. "Dear Lila," the email began, "we've been following your story and are incredibly inspired by your courage. We're organizing a town-wide youth summit on social justice and would be honored if you would be one of our keynote speakers." Lila read the email twice, her heart pounding. The thought of speaking at such a large event was intimidating, but the opportunity to continue sharing her message felt too important to pass up. "I think I'm going to do it," she told her mom, holding up the phone. Her mom smiled, setting down a stack of towels. "Of course you will," she said. "This is who you are now, someone who doesn't back down from a challenge." The weeks leading up to the summit were a flurry of preparation. Lila worked closely with organizers to craft her speech, focusing not just on her personal experience, but on the broader issues of fairness, accountability, and the power of community action. When the day of the summit arrived, the Silverbrook Community Center was filled to capacity. Young people from across the town and neighboring areas gathered to listen, learn, and share their own stories. The energy in the room was electric, a palpable sense of purpose uniting everyone present. As Lila stepped onto the stage, she took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the crowd. She spotted her mom sitting in the front row, her face glowing with pride. "Hi everyone," Lila began, her voice steady. "My name is Lila Hart, and I want to talk to you about something that's not always easy to talk about: justice." She spoke about her experience with Officer Grayson, but she also highlighted the progress that had been made since then: the community meetings, the rallies, and the small but meaningful changes within the police department. "This journey hasn't been easy," Lila admitted. "There were times when I wanted to give up, when I felt like my voice didn't matter. But I've learned something important. Even the smallest voice can make a big impact if you use it to speak the truth. As she continued, Lila's confidence grew. She talked about the power of unity, the importance of holding people accountable, and the need for everyone, regardless of age or background, to stand up for what's right. We can't change the past, she concluded, her voice ringing with conviction, but we can shape the future. And it starts right here, with all of us. The applause was thunderous, filling the room with an energy that left Lila both overwhelmed and deeply moved. As she stepped off the stage, several attendees approached her, sharing their own stories and thanking her for inspiring them to take action. One boy about her age hesitated before stepping forward. "Lila," he said quietly, "I just wanted to say thank you. I've always been scared to speak up, but hearing you makes me think maybe I can." Lila smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "You can," she said firmly. "Your voice matters too." That evening, as she sat on the porch with her mom, the cool night air wrapping around them, Lila reflected on how far she had come. "Do you think things will really change?" she asked, her voice thoughtful. Her mom looked at her with a gentle smile. "Change takes time," she said, "but you've already started something incredible. And as long as people like you keep pushing, things will get better." Lila nodded, her mom's words comforting her. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew she was part of something much bigger than herself, a movement that was just beginning. As the stars twinkled above them, Lila felt a quiet sense of peace. She had faced her fears, spoken her truth, and inspired others to do the same. And though the road ahead would undoubtedly have its challenges, she was ready to keep fighting for herself, for her community, and for a better future. For the first time in a long time, Lila felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The story of Lila Hart is more than a tale of a young girl facing injustice. It is a powerful reminder of the strength that lies within each of us to speak up against what is wrong. Her courage to stand tall in the face of fear not only brought justice for herself, but ignited a movement for change in her community. Lila's story teaches us that bravery doesn't mean the absence of fear. It means finding your voice despite it. Through Lila's journey, we see how one person's stand can inspire others to act, creating ripples that reach far beyond what they might have imagined. Her actions didn't just hold a single officer accountable, they opened the door for a larger conversation about fairness, accountability, and the power of unity. The lesson is clear. When we refuse to remain silent in the face of injustice, we open the door to transformation. It might be slow, it might be hard, but change is possible. And sometimes, it starts with the courage of one person who dares to say, "This is not right." As we reflect on Lila's story, it's essential to recognize that her fight is not unique. Around the world, countless individuals face challenges and injustices, some of which go unnoticed or unheard. Lila's journey shows us the importance of listening, supporting, and standing alongside those who speak out, ensuring that their voices are not lost in the noise. If this story moves you, we want to hear your thoughts. Did it inspire you? If you thought the story was good, comment with a 1. If you thought it was amazing, comment with a 2. And most importantly, we'd love to hear your stories. Have you ever faced a moment when you had to find your voice? Have you ever seen someone take a stand that made a difference? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more meaningful and impactful stories like this one. Share your thoughts and be part of the conversation because together we can continue to learn, grow, and inspire change. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.